Joining me now for this edition of the KFS Pregame Show podcast, a friend of the pod, a returning guest. You know her work, and hopefully you enjoy her work as much as we do here at Knicks Film School. You could find her over at Indy Cornrows, the Pacers blog for SB Nation. You can also hear her on the podcast Indy Cornrows, which she co-hosts with other friend of the pod, Mark Schindler. She is Caitlin Cooper. Caitlin, welcome back to the Knicks Film School podcast.
Hey, always a pleasure to be back. It feels like every time I'm on here, it's to talk about a Pacer who never becomes a Knick. Like Jonathan and I rehashed this the last time I was on, because when he was still doing a newsletter at the Strickland, we did like an email exchange about Victor Oladipo and that potential. And then he had me on to talk about Miles Turner. And then last summer I came on again to talk about Malcolm Brogdon. And none of these things ever come to fruition, but I'm always happy for the return invitations.
So I will hopefully put your mind at ease that I have very little Knicks Pacers rumors to talk about. We'll obviously have to discuss Obi Toppin and the rumor that came up a few weeks ago. But I actually just want to talk to you about the Knicks and the Pacers and the matchup that's happening when people are hearing this tonight at Madison Square Garden between what I don't want to say surprisingly, because the Knicks, there are some Knicks fans that thought this was a 45-win team, but I know that not a lot of people had high hopes for the Pacers nationally. But between the sixth and seventh best teams in the Eastern Conference, according to record, and I want to start there. The vibes in Indiana with this team, is it a surprise that this team is as good as it is so far this season? Is it I don't want to say a disappointment, because I'm hoping people are enjoying watching good basketball as opposed to a full tank. But how are the vibes right now in Indiana with this basketball team?
I mean, I think it's pretty night and day by comparison to last season. Mm-hmm. Like, we did a year-end pod talking about the year 2022 and how much different the teams were entering into one year and leaving the prior compared to last season. So last season, there was a lot of fan apathy. Most of the interest was around who was going to be traded and when those trades were going to happen. I mean, not to be rude, but they were kind of borderline a hate watch. And I like watching a lot of those players individually, but the mix just wasn't right. And they had, become somewhat stale. It was time to make changes, and that was very evident. Headed into this season, I think if you even asked like the front office members, decision makers with the team, the way this was billed going into media day was very much setting expectations for, hey, this isn't going to be about wins and losses. This is about measuring the internal growth of these young guys that we have and how much, we can see that they've developed as month over month. And they even talked about how they knew last year at the trade deadline there wasn't going to be a quick fix, that they needed to do something dramatic, and that they were okay with that they were okay looking at 3 and 4 year increments rather than the 1 and 2 year increments that they had been looking at. So that indicates to me that they weren't expecting that they were going to be quite the team that they've been so far this year. And to answer your question about the fan base, I mean, I think that my general pulse on it, I think there are some who would have maybe preferred that they not shortchange things around Tyrese Haliburton and Benedict Mathurin, maybe get another good draft pick headed into this. And that was kind of my opinion headed into the season, if I'm being honest. But now that we've seen how they've been, especially over these last 10 games, I think have been more meaningful. And I think that fans have really kind of rallied around this group. The chemistry between the players has been really good. The way they support each other on the court has been really good. And, they've even had a couple sellouts in between Christmas and New Year's Eve, which is a big difference, because I think right now they still rank like 29th in the NBA and percentage of attendance. But they've started getting fans back in the building again. So big turnaround from last year to now.
Well, speaking of last year to now, obviously we'll get to the Haliburton rise, if you want to call it that, but that some of that even started last season. Like you said, the expectations, I'm sure, were tempered a bit after the Sabonis trade, I should say. And as a result, the team, it's funny getting from an outsider's perspective, the temperature of how Pacers fans feel about this team and how sustainable it is. Because just looking at like basketball stats, the NBA stats page, you see 14th in offense, you see, I think, 17th in net rating, and you wonder how 23 and 18 exists. What would you say to the uninformed, I should say, that don't watch the Pacers every day, is the secret to how they got to 23 and 18 this season?
Well, I would say I was among them for a while. I mean, early in the season, they had a fairly soft schedule and they kept catching teams with injury luck. I mean, I remember talking about the 4-game win streak they had before they went out on the 7-game West Coast road trip, and some of the things they were doing defensively, I was just wondering, like, how sustainable is this? So, like, for instance, they beat the Orlando Magic twice, but Paolo Banchero and Wendell Carter Jr. were not playing. So they did some like switch to blitz against Franz Wagner, and that was effective. But in your head, you'd be like, okay, but what if those other guys are out there? And they beat the Miami Heat on the second night of a back-to-back, and Jimmy Butler didn't play. They beat the Houston Rockets in Houston, and Eric Gordon torched them for 20 points in the first half. They came out and went switch to blitz against him. But Kevin Porter Jr. wasn't out there, and the Rockets shot the ball really poorly. Same thing they went down to Charlotte. Like, these are not good basketball teams that they were getting wins against. But again, they went down to Charlotte. They were court trafficking LaMelo, and the Charlotte Hornets shot 1 for 7 in the fourth quarter. So then they go on this 7-game West Coast road trip, and it's pretty rocky. They were trailing by 15 or more points in most of those games. A lot of guys weren't shooting the three well. This is a team that's very dependent on shooting the three well. And you started seeing little changes where, like, okay, well, now opponents, whether it's Nurkic, whether it's Sabonis, whether it's, Jokic before they went on the road trip, are starting to cross match and defend Jalen Smith with fives, and that was marginalizing Miles a little bit. It was disrupting their offense, and over that 7-game stretch, I believe they had the worst half-court offense in the NBA. So I remember there was somebody on Twitter who made a comment to me along the lines of, like, Rick Carlisle isn't up for this job. Like, they're going to have to make a change. And I just felt like, oh my word, like, they're vastly overachieving, exceeding expectations. God. Like, how did we get here? And I made this thread, and by the end of it, I was like, they've overachieved. Let's not move the goalposts, because I was just expecting some regression after like I said, some of the defensive tactics that they were using. I'm just like, I don't know if that's going to work if everybody's out on the court for them. But now, that Knick game was kind of a turning point for the Pacers, to be honest. They had some late game struggles, as we know, isolating against Julius Randle, some of that stuff that happened. And the light really turned for Tyrese and the rest of the team. Not that Tyrese wasn't playing well beforehand. He obviously was. But they play the next game against the Boston Celtics. They get up huge in that first half, and then it narrows at the end of the game, and Tyrese is making a lot better decisions. The next game was really the big one against the Miami Heat. In the prior matchup, Tyrese had scored 1 point. The switching scheme really bothered him, and that goes back to last season. The teams that switch, he can kind of spin his tires and have problems driving against length. They go into that game, and he's just really hunting the switch pocket. So, there's always this little gap that when one defender hands you off to the next, if you have really deep range, if you're like, Trae Young, and you can rise up into that space, that's what Tyrese did. So he attempted 16 threes in that game. He goes for 43 points. By the end of it, after he's hit the switch pocket so many times, Bam's playing him closer. Now he can drive the switches, and he makes the game winner. So that's been a big turning point for him. His clutch processing at the end of the games has really changed. And since they played the Knicks, they're 8-2. They made a starting lineup change. Aaron Nesmith's at the 4 now, not Jalen Smith anymore. That's put Miles back at the natural 5. He's being defended by 5s. They've won in a lot of different ways. Like, if you just look at their last several games, they play the Clippers. It's crunch time. They're hunting Luke Kennard while also running offense. They end up getting Zubats to have to come back out on the floor. They force the Clippers to play big because Miles is going at switches. Good processing there. They play the Toronto Raptors, and they win the game with their bench. They outscore Toronto's bench 57-4. They play the Portland Trailblazers, and over the last 6 minutes of that game, they hold the Trailblazers to 2 points over 6 minutes. So they do it with defense. And now this most recent win over Charlotte, they scored 43 points in the fourth quarter, and Charlotte tried a lot of different defensive coverages, and they couldn't get stopped. So it's just starting to feel more meaningful to me that they're able to win games in different ways, and they are doing this against healthier opponents as well.
So a couple things. First of all, it makes total sense that something happened around a Knicks game that launched another team into a successful stretch. Another thing, I cannot tell you how relatable it is. The outcry for the firing of a coach that may or may not be doing a bad job, but expectations are what they are. And of course, and I'm not someone that is like a Thibodeau apologist. I just like look at the talent level on this team. And while there are things I wish were different about the end of game offense or certain adjustments that he could make or some rotational decisions, I think we all would have signed up for 22-19 at the beginning of the season. And then as far as the injury luck, the Knicks have a similar track record this season. They are 16-7 against teams under 500 and 6-12 against the teams over 500. And the 6 wins are the Pacers. Not the Pacers. Well, obviously that is one of them, but the Sixers without Embiid, Jokic with the Nuggets without Jokic, the Suns when they were over 500 without Booker. There's another, and like the one good one was this weird Sunday night game against the Cavaliers where they were missing Jared Allen, but like the Cavs uncharacteristically shot like 12% from 3, and there were 13 travels called in the game. So I understand the idea of sustainability being a question. And before I ask you about the I'll say it on behalf of Knicks fans that are informed, the potential all-star Tyrese Halliburton, because I know something else happened after that Knicks game that might have sparked his effort going forward. Do you see the front office seeing this as sustainable? Do you think that they'll continue toward a playoff push, or like where do you see this headed toward the trade deadline?
I think it's getting harder and harder to pull the plug. I mean, I think that the key linchpin here is what is Miles Turner's plans with the extension. I am very risk averse. So if he's not going to sign an extension before the trade deadline, I would be looking to move him because I wouldn't want to risk him walking for nothing. They could gamble and hope that he resigns. And like from what I have no idea what his thinking is. I don't know if he wants to stay in Indiana. It seems like he's really enjoying the fact that he's playing at the 5 again and playing with Tyrese Halliburton. And he's been very complimentary of the fan base and other things that have regard to the Pacers. But you don't know. Like there's no guarantees. So after the trade deadline's over, what if they're not playing at this level anymore? What if they get into a play-in tournament game and things go like what happened? I don't know if you'll remember this game, but what happened for the Charlotte Hornets against the Indiana Pacers 2 years ago when they got absolutely smashed in the play-in tournament game, and a lot of their vibes that were very good that season went into a sour note into the summer. And now Miles can listen to other teams. He himself, when he was on the Woj pod, mentioned and said, "Hey, look, the Pacers could risk losing me for nothing." I mean, he noted that. So time has passed since then. The Pacers are obviously playing at a very high level, but he's very important. If he's not going to be on this roster after the trade deadline, that changes a lot for the Pacers. I mean, you can see that over the last several games, not just the big block that got promoted all over on social media against Plumlee the other night and what he's doing defensively, but the way that he's impacted matchups at the end of the game, like I said, against the Clippers went small. He's actually doing some things against switches this year that forced Ty Lue's hand and made them put Zubats back into the game. And now Tyrese is able to go as Zubats' dropped coverage. There's no one else on the roster doing that. There's Jalen and Isaiah Jackson cannot defend to the level that Miles Turner has. And something that's probably gone underrated with him is how much his role has even changed defensively because they're playing these 4-guard lineups. They're basically playing 8 guards every night. They're not playing 2 bigs at once anymore. His ability to stay around the rim, they're sometimes assigning him to low usage wings, putting Buddy Hield on opposing 5s. He might guard Jared Allen. He might guard Kristaps Porzingis so that they can switch everything. And Miles really has to stay around the basket and stay low. Or like we'll probably see, on Wednesday night, if he's defending a big like Mitchell Robinson who isn't going to do something out of the paint, they practically play him in a one-man zone and keep him way far back, which again, then you have to funnel everything to him. So he's a linchpin to a lot of what they're doing. So in terms of whether they playoff push or pull the plug, I think they're kind of past the point of no return on that to a bit with how many wins they've, accumulated to this point. And, I don't know what will happen if they have to move Miles. They're not going to be competitive in the playoffs or in a play-in tournament to me if he's not here, unless they really just like hit a home run with whatever trade they make. But that kind of puts them in a tough spot because, this season, originally they went into it probably thinking they were going to get a good draft pick. That's kind of that ship's starting to sail now. And now if you get to the end of the season, there's value to be had in playoff experience, but you're not going to be as competitive if you have to move that guy.
Well, let's actually stay there now that we're at this point of talking about how the trade deadline, or specifically how the expectations coming into this season might have led to a draft pick. Can I get the Lakers question out of the way now? Because I'm sure you're tired of being asked it. The Russell Westbrook for Buddy Hield and Miles Turner rumors that just kind of took over the offseason. That was almost like a foregone conclusion. Are you sick of hearing about that? Do you foresee it coming up again? Or is that even in play anymore?
I mean, that's probably somewhat to the Lakers. I felt as soon as it became as public as it was, that it all became a lot less likely. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as everybody knew that the Lakers, do not want to give up both picks, and the Indiana Pacers are very much holding to the fact that they want both picks, whichever side blinks was going to get blamed and pegged as the loser of that trade. So that led me to believe that it was going to be a lot less likely to occur. It doesn't sound like the Lakers are willing to budge, and I don't see that the Pacers are going to be willing to do that unless that they're going to get those 2 valuable picks. So
Is that a trade you would have potentially done if you were the GM?
For both?
Yeah, for both picks.
I mean, if they would have done it before the season started, I think that was probably the tipping point, or very early on if they had done it. I think it's a little bit different situation now. I know a lot of people that want to counter it bring up the point that those are the Los Angeles Lakers. So those picks, like we think LeBron's going to age out, but will those picks still be valuable if they can just sign other big time players to come to LA? Like it's a different market advantage. So that's a tough one for me to call. And the one thing that goes on with Miles is he's kind of been in trade rumors for his entire career, it seems. Every year we're back here, but I've never heard what any of the trade packages for him are, with the exception of when the Pacers tried to get Gordon Hayward from the Boston Celtics. I've never heard what another team has offered, so I really don't know how to peg his value. A year ago, before the foot injury happened, I kind of thought, if they could get like the Aaron Gordon package that the Magic got from the Denver Nuggets, where you're getting, expiring contract, a young player that you're kind of intrigued by in a first, I kind of thought that that's where that would be. But Miles is, he's played better, but now he's on an expiring contract. Whatever team gets him, if he's not going to be willing to sign an extension, it could be a half-year rental. So I really have a lot of trouble pegging exactly what his value should be at this point in time.
Which completely fair when you figure all the things that you mentioned. Let's talk about Tyrese Haliburton, because his career began, at least as far as Knicks fans are concerned, with a lot of. Let me just give you a little backstory. There are a lot of Knicks fans that wanted the Knicks to draft Tyrese Haliburton with the 8th pick. There are some reports that he avoided talking to the Knicks because he didn't want to go to New York, and it became anything Obi Toppin did became could have had with Tyrese Haliburton, and it almost was a comparison of the two players. Obviously, now that he's a team removed from the team that drafted him, it's different, but you still can't help but wonder what if. Now, we love Jalen Brunson. We're happy with Jalen Brunson, but you obviously have to look at what the draft pick could have been with if you had just drafted Haliburton in the first place. What do you see that's different from him this year? Because I personally think he's a surefire all-star. When you look at the advanced metrics, they also scream surefire all-star. What about him this year would you put as the main reason why he's elevated his play to that level?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to look up, I don't know the numbers on this, but if anybody's ever averaged 20 and 10 and not made an all-star game, over these last 10 games, he's 50, 40, 90. So I think that the main difference for him, there's a lot of little nuances that I could point to and of ways that he's improved his game. But when he came over from the Pacers over those last 26 games, he only led the team in shot attempts, I believe, 3 times. His usage rate was below 20, which there's only 3 or 4 players who've ever made an all-star team in the backcourt going back to 2012. With a usage rate that low. It was like Chris Paul last year aging out, Steve Nash in like a legacy bid with the Phoenix Suns, and I'm thinking Kyle Korver counted as backcourt, but he was like an injury replacement. So I don't even remember who the other person was. But point being is, for him, it was going to need to be, how does he maintain this way that he plays and is so inclusive and gets his teammates involved and maximizes shots for other people while also finding his own offense. And he's managed to do that this year. He's upped his usage rate. I think he's right at around 28 or 29, according to Cleaning the Glass. And like I said, he's down in Miami and he takes 16 threes in a game. That's not something he would have done last year. There was different coverages last year that you could point to with him and be like, okay, if you're a team like Cleveland with Evan Mobley, if you're a team like Miami with Bam Adebayo, or if you weak to switch him, that's going to give him problems. And there was times where when Malcolm Brogdon was still in the lineup with him, that the offense would tilt to Malcolm instead of Tyrese because of that, to an effect. Now there's like 3 or 4 hacks that he's found. So like I said, finding the switch pocket's one of them. He's extended his range. He's willing to go to his lefty sidestep shot as well as going to the right. So it's harder to force him left now. And then also just like, they really use Buddy Hield well with him. The two of them, they're the number 1 assist combo in the NBA. So if he gets a switch, they like to ghost that switch with Buddy. That helps him get hesitation into the paint. And then he's just found a really good balance in those end of game situations where they still continue to run offense while he's, finding that matchup. So like, they didn't win the game in Philadelphia. They kind of snatched victory out of the jaws of defeat in that one. But on the final possession in regulation, before they had a couple costly turnovers there, Tyrese hunts James Harden. He's going to get him and use him as a turnstile on the perimeter to get into the paint, but they're also using Miles Turner as a flare screener. That way, when Trez has to make a choice. Is he going to stay attached to Miles at the elbow, the way that Miles is adjusted, or when Trez collapses on Tyrese going to the rim, then Miles is able to, follow right behind him and collapse, and then they got a dunk out of that. You're also able to see in some playmaking situations, like people know that I wrote the very long piece over the summer, tracking all of his jump passes and what their rate was and the fact that his assist rate was like 3 times higher when he was jumping versus when he wasn't, and the fact that he gets defenses to commit and what his eye manipulation is over these last several games, just watching him make pocket passes and the extra oomph that he does giving to rollers, and the fact that Miles Turner's rolling on more than 50% of his screens is a large product of Tyrese Haliburton. Whether it's I'm using a shot fake and really I'm going to throw the shovel pass, or I'm faking a shot, or I'm faking a pass and now I'm going to use my floater, or, he really plays that cat and mouse game really well. He makes other people better around him. So I don't think there's much question that he should be an all-star, but I will say this for Knicks fan benefit. I think that Jalen Brunson has been an all-star for the New York Knicks as well. I think Tyrese Haliburton has been an all-star for the Indiana Pacers. I've enjoyed both of them. And if I was being completely honest, if we look at the prior matchup, I think that Jalen Brunson outplayed Tyrese in that particular game for several reasons. But
it's funny. Unfortunately, I think Julius Randle has passed Jalen Brunson in the pecking order as far as the All-Star consideration. This December into January stretch, not the Bucks game on Monday night notwithstanding, when Julius went 9 of 29 and 1 of 12 from 3. He's been amazing. Jalen had like a minor downtick, but look, there are delusional Knicks fans that think they might get both in. I think the realistic scenario is they get one, and there's an even more realistic scenario they get both. They get 0. But we'll see. It would be nice if one of both. Honestly, I think Haliburton is in a different tier compared to Julius and Jalen. Obviously, another player that might come up in conversation going forward is Obi Toppin, Julius's backup. And there was a rumor a couple of weeks ago, I'll say report, that the Pacers and Knicks have engaged in at least conversations about Obi Toppin. Is this a player that could potentially interest you personally as an addition to the Pacers on a not necessarily a buy low type of deal, but this would obviously be a bench player that would come and potentially have more playing time in a different role than just Julius Randle's backup? What do you think about Obi Toppin?
I think Obi Toppin's interesting. I mean, for the Pacers, like I said, they're playing 8 guards a night. They don't have a lot of depth at the forward position, so there would be opportunity for Toppin, I think. In the sense that I know that New York's identity's kind of been all over the place throughout the season in terms of what type of team and how you can describe them, or at least for me, if I was going to describe them right now. But
how would you describe them? Hold on, how would you describe them?
I don't know exactly. I feel like every time you look at their numbers and stuff, things are changing. But the Pacers are second in transition frequency. So to have Obi Toppin running the floor and being electric with Tyrese in the way that, Tyrese kind of is the Pacers' identity in that regard. He wants to get those outlet passes and immediately head downhill. If you really listen to broadcasts almost every game, you're going to hear him barking at somebody to get the ball in quicker because he wants to push off makes as well as misses. He's great at throwing hit-ahead passes. He's always looking and peering over his shoulder for surveying the lay of the land for guys who can run out the way that Toppin can. So I think that would be a great match. And then as well as Toppin's never played with a stretch big like Miles, and we can debate how much the defense stretches to him, but he does space out to the perimeter in a way that you're not going to see with Mitchell Robinson and the other bigs that Obi Toppin has played with. So I think that would be a big change. And then just playing with Tyrese in general tends to make people better. So I also really like the way that, in my opinion, that Toppin's always pretty active. He's always looking for places to screen and cut and move. So my one drawback would be what I mentioned with Jalen before, that teams were cross-matching 5s onto Jalen. So if Toppin was going to be your starting 4, I question if that would happen. I know he shot the 3 better this year, but I don't know what the credibility of that is, how many contests he's getting out there. So it's possible that some teams might try to hide their 5 and sag off and really clutter the pick and roll like what the Pacers were seeing about a month back on that road trip. So that might be something that I would give consideration to, but given that he's on a rookie scale contract, I don't know what New York's asking price was, but I don't think I would balk at it if that's such a deal that the Pacers tried to make. Yeah,
it's interesting. There's a portion of the fan base that I may be part of, but not. It's like I have like a partial membership to the Obi Toppin hive, in that the biggest fear is him going to another team that will, like you said, let him run in transition and put him with a point guard that will cater more to his skill set and completely unlock him. You took him with the 8th pick in the draft, and he's been a 15 to 18 minute a night player since he's been here. And 18 is on a good night when Tibbs decides to play him next to Julius Randle. Julius returning to a version of what he was 2 years ago. Honestly, better when you look at the fact that people are in attendance and the long twos are just like non-existent. It seems a little bit more sustainable that you understand if they were to send Obi for his benefit to a place like Indiana. There is that fear that like, man, this could have been us, even though Brunson's more of a half court player and not going to be someone that runs and helps Obi in that way. So you understand it. The player that, so we did a thing called cap or no cap, where we like to break down the actual way teams could operate come trade deadline and what the landscape looks like a couple weeks ago. And we proposed the idea of a Chris Duarte for Obi Toppin trade. There would be, I think Jeremy, our capologist, mentioned a protected pick, someone there, maybe even a second round pick somewhere in there. Just on its face, Duarte, first, if you could tell my listeners a little bit about how his season has gone, as well as like what Knicks fans could potentially be looking for in a player like Chris.
I like Chris. I was pretty high on him headed into this season, honestly. I wrote a piece saying what I had broke down some of his offseason film. He played one summer league game, and I didn't think he needed to play more than one summer league game. And then he played for the Dominican Republic's national team in FIBA qualifying. And I felt pretty good about some of the stuff that you had seen there because he was playing with a lot more patience in the pick and roll. Sometimes last season, he could be a little bit like an irregular heartbeat where, you know, if he saw a hedge, he'd stay on ball too long, or sometimes he would attack before the screen ever came, and he would want to play off 1 foot. And he really likes to stare down his passing targets. And when I watched him playing in FIBA, like obviously the competition level is different, but you saw a different level of patience where he was calling up screens, getting him to flip sides, and then actually using his weak hand and firing a pass with one hand. Like, and the Pacers also mentioned a lot of this. Like in media day, they talked about like his patience is better. Like I think we're going to see good things from him. The season started. He's in the starting lineup. Obviously, the Pacers have brought Benedict Mathurin off the bench almost all year, except for 2 games. And he got his shot did not start the season well. There was a game against the Spurs where I felt like he had tweaked his toe, which last year he finished the season. He didn't play the final 12 games of the year, and I don't know how much that was limiting him. And then he sustained the ankle. He was out of the starting lineup. They started starting Aaron Nesmith at the 3 spot along with Jalen. Then he came back and he started a couple more games, but he injured his ankle against the Miami Heat. Then he was out for 5 weeks. So now he's come back. I think his first game back was actually against the Knicks in the prior matchup. And in 5 of the last 6 games, he has not scored. He's 2 of his last 22 field goal attempts. I think he's shooting like 9% from the field. And it's just felt like something's just slightly off. I don't know if the foot is still bothering him a bit. There's times where it looks like he doesn't want to plant it completely, but it feels like whichever lineup you're going to play him in, he's going to run some of the same actions as Buddy Hield or Benedict Mathurin. And right now, there's just not a real compelling reason to be like, hey, let's run that play for Chris Duarte instead of Benedict Mathurin right now. Like, Chris can't get to the rim the way that Benedict can. And if he can't make shots, which he did make like 4 or 5 shots against the Celtics, but that's really been his only like solid game since he's come back from injury. So there is stuff that I like about him. I'm not exactly entirely sure why stuff isn't clicking for him. Something that I've kind of considered is maybe not having Sabonis as a playmaking hub. Like if he did go to New York and he could play somewhat off of Julius Randle, that might help him with like DHO stuff, because Sabonis assisted by far the majority of his 2s last year and his shots around the rim, not just like kicking out to him for 3. So, you know, maybe if that was an option for him again, some of his season would turn around. But I still like him. I'm sure the Pacers are still going to want to evaluate stuff as the trade deadline nears, but they do have to remember that, you know, he's 25, 25. And if you look at their starting lineup right now, like even if they were to trade Buddy Hield at some point, which I don't think they're going to be in a big rush to do, I think you're going to start Andrew Nembhard and Benedict Mathurin, because Andrew just does so many important things for them defensively. He's ahead of Chris defensively. And, you know, if they find a 4-man to start instead of Aaron Nesmith, then I think that they're liking what they're seeing from Aaron Nesmith. So that even creates somewhat of a crunch off the bench. So I do think Chris is a player to watch. I like what he does, but he's had a pretty rough sophomore season to this point.
A 4-man like Obi Toppin potentially. Yeah, that could make an interesting trade partner in the next few weeks. Let's wrap up with this matchup, because just looking at the raw numbers from the Pacers, specifically the last 10 games that you pointed out that they're 8-2, the number that Knicks fans go to when looking at the upcoming opponent is 3-point percentage. The Knicks are in love with their drop coverage, the Tibbs philosophy of packing the paint, protecting the rim. And it's led to, well, for my money, it's actually worked more than it hasn't this season. The Knicks are number 1 in the NBA in 3-point percentage against. How much that's attributed to the coverage, who knows? I know there's some luck involved there. but it does cause, if a team is hot, then they're going to be hot, and there's not much you could do. And the Pacers in their last 10 games, just looking at it, are 39% from three. And as far as volume is concerned, the Pacers are 8th in the NBA, making almost 14 threes a game during this 8-2 stretch. Is that a fair thing to focus on when it comes to how this matchup might go tomorrow night? That if the Pacers are hitting their threes, then it's signs of concern if you're a Knicks fan.
Well, right, because I mean, another thing that I would look at is Mitchell Robinson's offensive rebounding, and this is kind of an interesting trend for the Pacers because since they started going small, they rank 30th in second chance points allowed, 28th or 29th in opponent offensive rebounding rate. Obviously, we know what Mitchell Robinson can do on the glass. And one way that teams really zap what the Pacers do in transition is by sending people to the glass. So if the Pacers have to keep people there, 2 or 3 guys there, to keep Mitchell Robinson and prevent the second chance points, one way that the Pacers get a lot of the 3-point attempts that you're mentioning is in transition. They have one of the highest transition early 3-point attempt frequency rates since I believe the 2017-18 Rockets. So if you can prevent them from getting out and running and how they like to play early opposite and the 2-side fast break, that can at least prevent some of those opportunities. So I think watching the glass, like the Pacers have shown that they can win when they give up a lot of second chance points, in part because they make a lot of threes. But if you can prevent them from being able to run and get those threes, that's one way to do it. And then, like you said, with the drop coverage, that's a way to give up pull-up threes. But I actually thought Grimes was pretty impressive defending Haliburton in the prior game, not just bumping him off his angle, but one possession in the third quarter. I rewatched this game this morning. Haliburton rejected the pick and roll, which is what you'll see him do against drop bigs a lot of the time. That way he can get, the big on the opposite side and be able to get into the paint. That's the number one thing he'll do. And Grimes actually, very rare to see this. And the only other guy I've seen do this against Haliburton was Jaden McDaniels earlier this year, that if Haliburton rejects it, Grimes actually beat him to his spot, even though he didn't use the screen. So that in part is why I think they started hunting Julius Randle a little bit at the end of that game. It didn't make a lot of sense to me to be testing him in isolation the way that they were, but I don't think that they wanted to get away from the Grimes, Mitchell Robin pick and roll situation. So then they went to those isolations. I think for the Pacers, an adjustment that they need to make is if they do try to go to Randle, then bring another screen. They're a team that really likes to do and they always say they want to get to the next action. They don't isolate a lot. They've isolated a little bit more than what they were prior to that Knicks game, but if they get Julius Randle in space, then bring Miles and then make Julius Randle be the on-ball defender. Make them switch again so that you can get Mitchell Robinson or get him in the drop with Julius Randle being the trailer. I think it's one thing they can do, and then they kind of got away from it, but one thing that was affected for them too is they went to Horn's twist and used Andrew Nembhard as the Horn screener. Then that was able to get them Brunson as the on-ball defender instead of having Grimes. But then they just kind of went away from a lot of that stuff, which was fairly uncharacteristic for the Pacers. Haliburton's capable of making that righty three that he took against Julius Randle, but I don't think that was necessarily the best overall process. I think there's some adjustments they can make there. And then Knicks fans probably remember defensively that Brunson was very aggressive in the second half at hunting Buddy Hield, getting a lot of screens from RJ Barrett and Quickly and whoever else Buddy was defending so that he could just go right at him. So the Pacers are a team that really like to trap. They like to send guys if a matchup's not beneficial to them. So I'll be interested to see if they send help to Buddy Hield in that situation if he starts getting hunted again.
Potentially the return of RJ Barrett tomorrow.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that if he's going to be back from that laceration or not. So
it's tough to say because this injury has kind of been a mystery since it happened. Like when he pulled up lame a minute into that Dallas game and he just had his hand out and it's something happened. And it was I guess maybe it's a dislocation. Maybe he just got a cut and needs to go get it fixed. So he'll be back by the next TV timeout. And he hasn't been back in 2 weeks. So it's one of those things where as we found out more and more about it, it's gotten worse. It sounds like the cut was so deep that ligaments were appearing. It's one of those, we've joked around that you might as well say he got his finger chopped off. You might be right. And it's just that kind of injury that you got to wait for him to be able to play with stitches. He's listed as questionable. And usually when you go from doubtful to questionable with the Knicks, it means the next game you're ready to play. I think it's going to be a game time thing where he's going to warm up, take shots. And then if he's able to play without discomfort or at least without pain, more specifically shoot without pain, he'll be playing tomorrow night. So we'll see. The Knicks are just the more and more I look at the Pacers specifically, like you said, this little stretch since the last time they played, I am I think they're going to need all hands on deck for this matchup.
Well, and RJ benefits from the fact that in the prior matchup, they put Neesmith on Randall and they put Andrew Nembhard on Brunson. That's their two best defenders. So RJ is going to be drawing the weaker assignment. He'll have Buddy. So that's why I said they'll either be aggressive. They can either be aggressive with RJ attacking Buddy, or they can use RJ as the screener to get Brunson the better matchup. So they tried a lot of different looks against RJ. They just didn't really have a great answer when they're having to already use those two guys on New York's top two guys. So could be a good game for RJ Barrett if he is able to come back and be able to play.
Last thing before we get out of here, do you have any Knicks specific questions that you might have for me?
Well, yeah, I mean, I watched that Bucks game and two things stood out. I should say I watched it. I was working and it was on in the background, so I did not see the entirety of it. Number one is Isaiah Hartenstein, the backup big now.
Mm-hmm.
Will he continue to be the backup big against the Indiana Pacers?
So you know how you said the Knicks have been messing around with this rotation and trying to find an identity? We're at the point where I think like the Evan Fournier and the Cam Reddish and the Derrick Rose experiments are done. That I think is the next hill to climb, is that Jericho Sims, if he's ready, because I do think he would be better than Hartenstein. I don't think it's necessarily that much of a gap where you like it's imperative you need to play him over Hartenstein. I do think he has some footwork issues and some things he still has to learn. But I would expect Isaiah Hartenstein to be the backup big tomorrow night. Which, yes, every concern you have, Knicks fans absolutely can have those same concerns right now.
And what's interesting about it is I wonder, was his most recent game against the Pacers? Because I remember in the second half of that game when I was rewatching it that the Pacers actually played big because the Knicks played Sims and Hartenstein at the same time in that second half. So the Pacers played Ijax and Jalen Smith at the same time off the bench. And for whatever reason, the Pacers were having Ijax hedge. So it was like a rare sighting of Isaiah Hartenstein actually getting to make plays out of the middle of the floor, because it doesn't feel to me like the Knicks really use him the same way as the Clippers did a year ago in terms of being like a DHO hub or being to use playmaker stuff. But because the Pacers defended him that way, just organically, he kind of got to do some of it. So that actually kind of carved up their defense for a handful of possessions in the third quarter. So he might actually look better than what he has of late against the Indiana Pacers if they decide to strangely do that again. They were doing it to get the ball out of RJ's hands because they didn't have anybody in the bench that they felt capable of staying in front of him. But it was somewhat awkward.
Well, that's one of the things I'm most interested to see with RJ back, is because there was this weird stretch after the crazy Luka 60-point game where the Knicks didn't have RJ or Jalen Brunson for a couple games. And while the offense was dire, Julius and Quickly developed a nice little two-man game as a result. And it's made it so that way the Knicks are pretty much focusing on the fact that Julius or Brunson will be on the floor at any point. But before those injuries happened, RJ was the starter that played with the bench. So as a result, in this 9-man rotation, RJ, like you mentioned for that Indiana game, was really the only threat on offense, although he was playing with Quickly. And I wonder if Tibbs now looks at it and says, okay, if it's either going to be Julius playing with the bench or it's going to be Brunson playing with the bench, and it's this 2-man game with Quickly that they're going to take advantage of. I say all of that to say that the Knicks' newest identity might look a little different. And look, if there's a guy in this rotation that could use just one good game, so that way, for all it matters, where post game content creators live streams aren't all about him. You would have thought that Isaiah Hartenstein had a Charles Smith type of game. The way that our fan base reacted the other night to the loss against the Bucks, completely blaming him for why they lost to the Bucks.
There were some rough moments.
There was, believe me, there were, especially at the end of that third quarter. But the guy played 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'm not saying in the margins 10 minutes can't decide a game, but it was also 10 minutes. Yeah.
I mean, next question: why is Julius Randle taking 9 threes in the first quarter, and then in the fourth quarter when he's open on the short roll, has all the hesitation in the world and doesn't want to take a pull-up?
Well, I do think the Milwaukee game was an anomaly because
the drop coverage.
Well, the drop coverage to an extent, but the guy was 1 of 12. At a certain point, you just you don't have it. And when you're playing the Bucks, a team that is just if you want to keep if you want to go see if you can get to 15, 1 of 15, go ahead. Like, you are allowed to keep shooting it until you make it. He's during this December stretch, I think he's up to 37. Well, okay, after last night, that number is probably different, but it was something like 37%. On John quotes this stat in the newsletter recently that since a certain date in November, or it might have actually been December, second most threes in the NBA to Steph Curry. Well, I guess it had to be since the beginning of the season. He's taken the second most threes to Steph Curry this season. But the point being is that that's the type of volume that he's on, that he's up to like 8 a game. And for forwards, that's just ridiculous. But I mean, he's making them. So I think that's his process, is in the first quarter, see if he's got it going, take a bunch of threes. He's had like 4 or 5 3 or 4 3-pointers made in the first quarter games recently. And if he's got it going in the first quarter, then you ride it out. And this just was one of those games where they're giving it to him. He was missing, and in a make or miss league, it's going to stand out more. I mean, hey, look, the 2-man game between Brunson and Randall was pretty big against the Pacers late in that game. I mean, the Pacers had a 6-point lead with under 2 minutes to play. They're going to have to iron out. I vividly remember the two snafus the Pacers had where they tried to hedge and recover against Brunson and Randall. Nembhard got caught on Randall. Brunson makes that huge 3. And then a possession later, they switched it. Andrew was on Julius Randle, and Randle bullied him and ended up getting fouled. The Pacers challenged it. They lost the challenge. And like those two mix-ups felt pretty big. So obviously, I mean, I agree. Randle's having a much better season than he was a year ago. I probably shouldn't nitpick him for his short roll hesitancy against the Milwaukee Bucks. We all noticed, like, at a certain point, it's like, I'm already 9 of 28 or 9 or 29. I know I've got nothing going right now. And every time, like, when you've got defensive player of the year candidates in the paint, if I go to the rim, I may get a call. I may not. They were letting them play the other night as well. Sure. I just think that the Milwaukee game was an anomaly more than anything else.
Yeah. The battle between Brunson and Drew Holiday was pretty entertaining toward the stretch of that. I remember talking to Benji, your guy over at Knicks Film School over the summer. Like, I thought, one of my favorites, by the way, I'm sure everybody already follows him if you're watching this video, but always really enjoy watching his threads. But we talked over the summer because at the time, the Pacers were rumored to be interested in Jalen Brunson, in addition to the Knicks, in part because of Brunson's connections with Rick Carlisle in Dallas. And when they were playing the Warriors in that series, when the Mavericks were playing the Warriors were doing like hedge and under and going under quite a bit against against Jalen Brunson. And I was like, if he's not going to be willing to take pull-up threes, that's kind of problematic because they're hedging and keeping him out of the paint, and then they're going under. And he made a couple pull-up twos, but the two of us talked about it. And to see what his numbers are now, like, he's not taking a ton of pull-up threes, but he's hitting them at a decent clip. I think he's, at almost 3 attempts per game, making like 37%. Like, that's a pretty big turnaround from what I had expected to see, like, even just in the playoffs last year. So it was fun watching that shooting back and forth between those two guards last night. So
yeah, he's been. And look, this is more just like a Knicks specific issue, the point guard wasteland that has existed here for the longest time. The fact that, like, we got one is it's some fun to watch. That, oh wow, a point guard that might actually be your best player on certain nights, that can go off for 44 even if it isn't a loss. Have the shot making ability. The tough 2-pointers that he makes are just kind of unreal. So yeah,
who knew that point guards mattered? I mean, I said the same thing. Tyrese is the best point guard I've watched play for the Pacers in my lifetime, and I felt pretty confident about that after about 4 games. So, quite the difference that how offense
George
can look.
Hill, wow, how dare you?
Darren Collison's really going to be upset about that.
Yeah, wow. But Travis Best is upset, is rolling in his grave right now. Although he's alive, so I guess it's not rolling in his grave at all whatsoever.
Jamal Tinsley's feelings are hurt.
There you go. Throwback. Okay, Caitlin, I've kept you for longer than I said I would. Thank you so much for giving me your time. If you wouldn't mind, please tell everybody at home where they could find you on the internet.
Right. So my handle is at C2_Cooper. I'm at Indy Cornrows a couple times a week. We're doing a weekly podcast over there where we do a little bit longer episodes, but we cover broader topics. So our most recent one of those came out this morning. If people want to go over and listen and check in on what's going on with the Pacers.
Last question before I let you go. So okay. I go back to the 90s with my Knicks fandom. The Pacers, because the 90s are for Knicks fans, if they're old enough to remember it, they are the glory days, even though they didn't win a championship, but they were just like relevant every year. And the Pacers rivalry was always, obviously Reggie Miller, the game, literally the whole mid 90s and all the games that happened there. It's a game that I still circle on the calendar, and I'm, a dying breed because the Knicks Pacers rivalry is one playoff series since 2000. But I still look at like the Pacers as one of the Knicks' bigger rivals. Do Pacers fans, like, is that rivalry completely dead? Is it dead for you when it comes to the Knicks?
I will say that a lot of the Reggie Knicks stuff I was way too young. Like I'm like 6 years old when this stuff is happening. So like my memories of it are not super clear, but I think that fans still get up for this matchup. And the fact that sometimes I have Knick fans who message me and be like, look, some friends over at the Strickland who will be like, look, I'm glad that the Pacers are happy or are a fun team only for you because I like your writing. I wish no goodwill for the Indiana Pacers. So, I mean, I think that people still feel it. Okay.
I'm just making sure it's not just me. I'm glad to hear that there are still Knicks fans out there that get up for this matchup. Galen, thank you as always. You were outstanding. And I would say good luck. Or I guess when people are listening to this tonight, but I hope you at least enjoy watching the game, whether it's the outcome be damned,
I will. I think that this is an interesting matchup. Hopefully people think that it's interesting after I describe some of it and aren't like just bored and being like, I don't want to listen to this anymore. And
I'll co-sign that. I personally think people will listen to this and be like, oh, this actually will be a good game. Caitlin, thank you as always.
No problem.